We've only got you for about half an hour, so I'm going to quickly move on to the next one, which is Chinese influence in Australia. And you'll see a headline often with Chinese influence or tags Chinese influence. But I want to kind of see what you think about the nuts and bolts of it in terms of Chinese political influence in Australia and Chinese economic influence, let's say control over Australian assets.
Yeah.
So in the first one, political influence, we saw that big China spy story a few months ago, big 60 Minutes piece on it, which even had politicians like Andrew Hastie and I think James Patterson was on there.
Right.
It was run by kind of every major news publication, and then it came out a few months later that he was not a big enough spy for Australia to even worry about, according to Australia's intelligence services. We also have questions about like Gladys Liu. We have questions about we had the Sam Dastyari saga. Political donation seems to be a theme throughout. Should Australia be concerned about China trying to exert influence?
Yeah, so massive question, Dougal, and you've just highlighted why it is a big question because it cuts across so many different areas. Should we be concerned? Of course we should. You know, we've got the former ASIO head, Duncan Lewis, saying the level of foreign interference is unprecedented. Well, okay, right? It's unprecedented. So we should absolutely take it seriously. I guess there's a couple things that I do respond to that with, though. And one is China, there could be attempts at influence, and let's take our security agencies at their word for that. That's fine. But attempts at influence don't necessarily translate to success. So I'm not, even attempts should be taken seriously. But what we'd really worry about is if political decisions are being changed in response to those Chinese influence attempts, right? I mean, that's when our democracy really takes a hit. And on that point, I think the evidence is pretty clear that any political influence China has tried to exert, frankly, they've failed miserably. Let's have some confidence in our institutions for a start. You mentioned media coverage. Well, has there been a week in Australia over the last 2 years where there hasn't been a China influence story? So, you know, our free and independent media, which is, you know, welcomed and everyone likes it. I think it's doing a good job to the point where you do actually get stories like this Wang Liqiang spy story, whereas a big splash in the media at the start and then shortly afterwards, you know, people start...
probably like a page 12 retraction or something.
That's right. And so... Yeah, just on the Wang Liqiang, I actually worry that can be damaging. I'm not really worried about Chinese influence. What I'm worried about is media credibility, right? So if we see a number of those stories where big headlines get splashed with huge claims, I mean, the story was that he was a Chinese spy.
Yeah. I mean, the ABC ran a headline that this was the, I think, biggest espionage scandal or something since the Petrov affair in the Petrov thing in 1994.
Correct. Right. So that's the headline, Dougal. And then a couple of weeks later, not quite, the evidence isn't backing that up. So what does the average person on the street think? You know, Australian media can't really trust them anymore. And I think that's a tragedy because ASIO said that Chinese interference is a real concern. Media is one of our best sources of protection, but if their legitimacy is eroded through seeking headlines, no one wins out of that. And aside from that, probably the other thing I'd note is think about Australia's political decisions and strategic alignments over the last 2 years. Have we become closer to China? Not really. I mean, we were critical of their decisions in the South China Sea, as we should be. We've been very critical of their handling of human rights issues, such as what's happening in Xinjiang at the moment. We've got an Australian detained in China at the moment without access to a lawyer or his family. The Foreign Minister has been very outspoken, annoyed the Chinese embassy in Australia in a big way. And the Australian government, at least, in its strategic settings and its security relationship, is moving closer towards the United States, which is exactly the opposite of what China would hope for. So again, let's take the influence seriously, but keep some, let's keep the discussion grounded.
Yeah, well, I've seen some of your analysis, and people often get put into the camps of the hawks or the doves, pro-China, anti-China. Yeah. It seems like the intelligence community in Australia, and probably in America as well, has a lot of what would be like hawkish sentiments, or saying we should be careful about China seeking to exert influence in the region. And then the doves would be maybe someone like Keating, who comes out and is really pro-China as it goes. How do you see that debate in Australia, and where should Australia be? Because there's obviously an economic incentive to be closely tied to China and keep China happy, but it seems that there's also, like, do we have to be, like, how cautious should we be about our relationship with China?
We should be cautious. We should be cautious, absolutely. China involves challenges and opportunities. For example, I think some Chinese actions do threaten Australia's interests, right? An example of that would be in the South China Sea, right? Ignoring an arbitral decision, an arbitration panel assembled under the United Nations Law of the Sea. We say, and I think rightly, that we take international law and multilateral forums seriously because we're only a relatively small player. So might is right is never going to work for Australia. So when China does things like that, I think we should be...
Can I ask you one question?
Sure.